In this lesson, we're going to take a look at the Spanish-American War, a war that took place over 4 months in 1898. There were 4 causes for this war. As you can see, Cuba, pictured here, was one of them. The United States had over $50 million invested in sugarcane plantations in Cuba. And I don't mean that the government directly invested that money. It was private investors that had invested in these sugarcane plantations. But obviously, as we're going to learn, events in Cuba are going to get a little dicey, and we're going to be interested in protecting those investments. In 1895, Cuba was still a Spanish colony, so there were Spanish military in Cuba. And as this picture indicates, Jose Marti starts a war for Cuban independence. The Cubans had had enough and wanted to become independent from Spain. There were about 11 different daily newspapers in New York City alone at the time, and they themselves were in a war for circulation, meaning that they were each vying for a larger customer base. Well, war itself sells newspapers, so William Hearst's New York Journal and Joseph Pulitzer's New York World used sensational headlines and pictures on their front pages, exaggerating Spanish atrocities in Cuba to heighten the public dislike of the Spanish government, and by extension sell newspapers. This is known as yellow journalism, and there are some examples of that right here on the screen. Political cartoons like this were meant to gin up American anger at Spain. The title at the bottom says, "The duty of the hour to save her not only from Spain, but from a worse fate." Of course, this is meant to indicate that the Spanish were doing horrible things to the Cubans. Here's an example of the screaming headlines from the front cover of the Journal during this time period. You can see very large headlines: Spanish ships on our coast, mysterious warships seen by incoming vessels, maybe privateers. There's no actual proof that they were privateers. It's kind of leading you to draw conclusions that the newspaper wants you to draw, which again were related to getting Americans angry and literally pushing the United States government to declare war on Spain. The last cause was the explosion of the battleship Maine. The United States had sent the battleship Maine to Havana Harbor as a show of strength, again, send a message that American investment shouldn't be disrupted on the island of Cuba. And the battleship exploded in February of 1898. The newspaper headlines, as can be seen here, were quick to blame Spain. Sorry about that. You can see here from the headlines, destruction of the warship Maine was the work of an enemy, but right below that is a $50,000 reward put out for anybody that can provide information as to who did it. All right. So this is meant to lead you to believe, of course, that it was the Spanish that did it. And in fact, after a 2-month investigation, there was no clear answer as to who did it. As a matter of fact, they believed that it was simply a boiler explosion. A pressure from the steam in the engine room got too high and may have simply exploded. We may never know why the ship exploded, but with pictures like this and with articles in the paper indicating it was Spain, Americans were now beating the war drum, trying to demand that the president ask for a declaration of war. As this paper indicates, on April 11th, 1898, President William McKinley did just that. He asked Congress to declare war on Spain. The war will start a few weeks later, May 1st. Now, the Spanish colonized the Philippine Islands, which were not too far off the coast of China. I want to say about 1,000 miles or so. And so the United States government sent Commodore George Dewey from Hong Kong steaming into Manila Bay, Manila being the capital of the Philippines. The Spanish didn't expect this, so in about a 4-hour battle, pictured here, the United States defeats the surprise Spanish fleet in Manila Harbor, and the Spanish officially surrender the Philippines later on in August. We'll talk about that in a moment. But in about a 4-hour battle, the Philippines were ours. This picture shows the readying of troops, which took place right here on Long Island. Pictures of troops heading down to battle. And we can't talk about Cuba and the fighting that took place in Cuba, which was where most of the fighting took place, other than the Battle of Manila Bay, without talking about Teddy Roosevelt and his Rough Rider Cavalry unit. Theodore Roosevelt is going to make a name for himself commanding the Rough Rider Cavalry unit to several victories in Cuba, Kettle Hill, San Juan Hill being two of them. He'll become president, making a name for himself that he did. He'll become president later. Again, some more photos of the action in Cuba. As I said, the war was only about 4 months long. The Spanish are going to surrender, ending the war. The Treaty of Paris is going to be signed in December of 1898. Several things happen as a result of this treaty. One, Cuba becomes independent, as you see, which was what they wanted. The United States is going to get Puerto Rico and Guam, two islands under Spanish control. Now they were going to come under American control. Guam was going to be helpful as a Pacific island, as we discussed in the last lesson, in terms of Naval Base Coaling Station Island. And number three, the United States is going to get the Philippines from Spain. This is going to be a major benefit for us in our attempt to open China, which again we discussed in the last lesson and happened the following year, the open door policy in 1899. You see here that we're going to give Spain $20 million. This is because the Spanish had business interests and property interests on the Philippines, and many of the Spanish now were going to leave and go back to Spain. So this was compensation for their property losses. And once we gave them this money, they gave us control of the Philippines. As a result, this cartoon indicates American control now extended from the continental United States, of course. We controlled Alaska at this point, which we had purchased way back in 1867. You can see Puerto Rico in the Caribbean, and of course the islands that extended almost to China through the Pacific Ocean. So then, to sum up, U.S. investment in Cuba, yellow journalism by American newspapers, the explosion of the battleship Maine are going to gin up anti-Spanish sentiment in the United States, pushing the American government to declare war on Spain. The war lasts about 4 months, and you can see here less than 400 soldiers die in battle. About 2,600 more die from diseases such as malaria and yellow fever that they got in Cuba. The U.S. will acquire the Philippines, Puerto Rico, and Guam from the Spanish. Cuba is freed from Spanish rule, but they will not be freed from American involvement. America is going to maintain a strong hand, especially as it relates to Cuban foreign policy. We'll talk about that in the next lesson.